Malcolm X's name alone stirs a storm of emotions: admiration, fear, respect, and controversy. To some, he was a dangerous radical, a man who preached anger and division. To others, he was a prophet, a fearless truth-teller who spoke the words no one else dared to utter. But one fact is undeniable: his voice shook America to its core. Born into a world of fire and hatred, Malcolm's life was scarred by tragedy, sharpened in prison, and unleashed onto a nation unprepared for his thunderous demands for justice. He challenged presidents, clashed with civil rights leaders, and redefined what it meant to fight for freedom. And though bullets ended his life, they could not silence his message. Decades later, his speeches still ring with urgency. His story still unsettles the comfortable, and his vision still inspires the oppressed. Who was Malcolm X, really? A rebel, a prophet, a revolutionary, or something far more dangerous? This is the tale of a man whose life was cut short, but whose voice refused to die. Malcolm Little entered the world on May 19, 1925, in Omaha, Nebraska, into a household already marked for struggle. His father, Earl Little, was a Baptist preacher and a passionate supporter of Marcus Garvey's movement, preaching black pride, independence, and a return to Africa. But in 1920s America, such beliefs were a dangerous weapon. To white supremacists, Earl was not just a preacher. He was a threat. Hatred stalked the family from the very beginning. The Ku Klux Klan rode up to their home in the dead of night, shouting threats, warning Earl to stop his preaching. It was only the beginning. When Malcolm was just 4 years old, the family home in Lansing, Michigan, was set ablaze. Flames devoured the wooden walls, the family barely escaping alive. No one was ever punished, and neighbors whispered what everyone already knew: the fire was no accident. Tragedy struck again when Malcolm's father was found dead, his body crushed by a streetcar. The official report called it an accident. But rumors swirled. Earl Little had been silenced, another victim of racial terror, hidden under the mask of coincidence. To young Malcolm, the message was clear. In America, justice was not written for families like his. As if fate was determined to break him, his mother Louise, overwhelmed by grief and relentless harassment from welfare agents, was declared mentally unstable and institutionalized. The state scattered Malcolm and his siblings into foster homes, tearing apart the only family he had left. These were not just childhood wounds. They were scars burned deep into his soul. In those early years, Malcolm saw fire, loss, and betrayal. He learned that survival meant strength, and that silence in the face of injustice was a kind of death. It was in these flames of hate and abandonment that the boy named Malcolm Little began the long, painful transformation into the man history would call Malcolm. After the chaos of his childhood, Malcolm sought freedom in the bright lights of Boston and Harlem. The bustling streets, the jazz clubs, the nightlife, they promised escape from poverty and pain. But beneath the glittering neon was another world: hustlers, gamblers, pimps, and thieves. Malcolm slipped into it with ease. Sharp-dressed and quick-witted, he earned the nickname Detroit Red for his reddish hair and slick street style. He gambled in backrooms, dealt drugs, and survived by conning and stealing. To the outside world, he was just another hustler drifting deeper into the underworld. But even then, those who knew him recalled a restless intelligence in his eyes, a sharpness that made him stand out from the average street thug. Malcolm himself later admitted he was living fast and recklessly, as if racing against a clock he couldn't see. He indulged in drugs, women, and quick money, pleasures that dulled the pain of a childhood haunted by fire and loss. Yet beneath the laughter and the bravado, he was a young man without direction, caught in a dangerous spiral. It all came crashing down in 1946. At just 20 years old, Malcolm and his burglary crew were caught. In a system stacked against young black men, his sentence was harsh: 10 years in prison. For many, it was the end of the road. the point where hope collapsed and dreams withered. But for Malcolm, prison was not an ending. It was the beginning. The walls of Charlestown State Prison could have broken him. Instead, they became the crucible in which Malcolm X was forged. Locked away in a tiny cell, he began to read anything and everything he could get his hands on. Dictionaries, history books, philosophy, religion. He copied out entire pages just to strengthen his mind. Slowly, the hustler's sharp tongue transformed into the orator's sharp blade. And in those same years, letters from his siblings introduced him to the teachings of the Nation of Islam. The words of Elijah Muhammad reached Malcolm like a revelation. He abandoned the identity of Malcolm Little, the name of slavery's legacy, and embraced a new one. Malcolm X. The X symbolized the unknown name of his true African ancestors, erased by history. What began as punishment became transformation. The hustler died in a prison cell, and in his place rose a man whose words would one day shape the world. When Malcolm X walked out of prison in 1952, he was not the same man who had walked in. The hustler was gone. In his place stood a man armed with discipline, intelligence, and an unshakable belief in his purpose. Almost immediately, he became one of the Nation of Islam's most passionate ministers, and soon its most electrifying voice. The Nation of Islam was still small then, dismissed by mainstream America as a fringe group. But Malcolm's charisma transformed it. He could stand before a crowd of 10 or 10,000 and command every ear. His words were sharp as daggers, slicing through America's illusions of equality. He thundered about the hypocrisy of a nation that preached democracy abroad while lynching black men at home. To the oppressed, Malcolm X's message was fire and freedom. He declared that black people should stop waiting for white America to grant them justice, and instead seize it by any means necessary. He taught pride in black identity at a time when self-hatred was widespread. He warned against drugs, crime, and dependency, speaking directly to those who had lived lives like his own. But his rise was not without controversy. In an era where Martin Luther King Jr. called for love and nonviolence, Malcolm was unapologetically militant. He mocked the dream of integration, calling it a trap, and argued that white America would never voluntarily share power. To many whites, he became the embodiment of their greatest fear, a brilliant, uncompromising black man who refused to be silenced. The media couldn't ignore him. Cameras followed him, journalists quoted him, and suddenly Malcolm was everywhere, on television screens, in newspapers, debated in churches and barbershops. He was the man who made America listen, even when it didn't want to. The Nation of Islam's membership exploded under his leadership, swelling from a few hundred to tens of thousands. Mosques opened across the country, fueled by Malcolm's tireless work. He spent endless nights traveling, speaking, teaching, a whirlwind of energy who seemed unstoppable. But power brings enemies. As Malcolm's star rose, so too did tensions. Government agencies like the FBI began keeping files on him, seeing his influence as a danger to national stability. Inside the Nation of Islam itself, jealousy and suspicion began to grow. Malcolm's voice was powerful, but it was also unpredictable. And in America, unpredictable voices rarely go unchallenged. This was no longer just the story of a man. It was the making of a prophet, one whose fire would soon burn too brightly for anyone to control. By the early 1960s, Malcolm stood at the height of his influence. He was the Nation of Islam's most famous minister, its most powerful recruiter, and the face of its growing empire. Crowds flocked to hear him speak. Reporters chased his words. Even the White House took note of his every move. But with every speech, every headline, Malcolm's shadow grew larger than the nation itself. And that shadow began to stir unease. Behind the polished veneer of unity, cracks were spreading. Elijah Muhammad, the nation's leader and Malcolm's spiritual guide, began to feel threatened by his protégé's meteoric rise. Whispers reached Malcolm's ears that Elijah, the man he revered almost as a father, was entangled in scandals, fathering children with his secretaries. At first, Malcolm dismissed them. Loyalty bound him. But as more voices confirmed the rumors, disillusionment crept in. Could the man he had devoted his life to truly be flawed? Then came the assassination of President John F. Kennedy in November 1963. While America mourned, Malcolm's response was blunt and shocking. The chickens coming home to roost. The nation silenced him for 90 days. But the punishment carried a deeper message. Malcolm's voice, once their greatest weapon, was now becoming too dangerous, even for them. This suspension became a moment of clarity. Malcolm began to question not just the leadership of Elijah Muhammad, but the very limitations of the nation itself. Was the struggle for black liberation really confined to the walls of one organization? Or was the fight far bigger, a struggle for human rights that spanned the globe? In 1964, Malcolm broke away, founding his own organizations, the Muslim Mosque, Inc., and later the Organization of Afro-American Unity. No longer bound to the strict dogma of the nation, his message began to evolve. He spoke not only of black nationalism, but also of solidarity with oppressed people everywhere. His vision was no longer just about America. It was about the world. Then came the journey that would change him forever, the pilgrimage to Mecca. In Saudi Arabia, Malcolm stood shoulder to shoulder with Muslims of all races, Arabs, Africans, Asians, and even white men, united in prayer. He wrote with awe of seeing blonde-haired, blue-eyed men I could call my brothers. This was a revelation. For years, Malcolm had preached that the white man was inherently evil, but Mecca showed him something different, that racism, not skin color, was the true enemy. When he returned to America, he carried a new message, one of global unity, human rights, and the possibility of brotherhood across races. But this evolution also made him more dangerous than ever. To the Nation of Islam, he was now a traitor. To the U.S. government, he was now not only a black nationalist, but an international figure capable of connecting the African American struggle with global revolutions. He had outgrown the cage that both his enemies and his allies tried to keep him in. Malcolm X had found a higher calling, but revelations often come at a price. And for Malcolm, that price would soon be his life. February 21st, 1965. A cold Sunday in Harlem. Inside the Audubon Ballroom, a crowd gathered to hear Malcolm X speak. Families, young activists, and curious neighbors filled the rows of seats. Among them sat his wife, Betty Shabazz, cradling their daughters. The air hummed with anticipation. Everyone knew that when Malcolm spoke, sparks flew, sparks that lit fires of hope, anger, and truth. But beneath the chatter and shuffling chairs, danger lurked. Malcolm had been receiving death threats for months. His house had been firebombed just a week earlier while his wife and children slept inside. He knew enemies were closing in, yet he came anyway. To him, silence was more terrifying than death. Malcolm stepped onto the stage, tall, commanding, dressed in a dark suit. As he adjusted the microphone, his presence drew the room to stillness. He was just about to speak when chaos erupted. A man shouted, "Get your hand out of my pocket." A staged distraction. In that split second, panic rippled through the crowd. Then came the thunder. Gunfire shattered the air. The first shot rang out, and a hail of bullets followed. Malcolm fell backward. His body struck again and again. Over 20 wounds tearing through him as the audience screamed and scrambled for cover. Betty rushed forward, shielding her children's eyes, as chaos consumed the ballroom. Malcolm X, only 39 years old, lay dying on the stage. Paramedics arrived too late. By the time he reached the hospital, the man who had once declared himself unafraid of death was gone. 3 men from the Nation of Islam were quickly arrested and convicted of the murder. But questions surfaced immediately. Who really ordered the assassination? Was it merely vengeance from the nation, angered by Malcolm's breakaway? Or was there a deeper hand, the FBI's COINTELPRO, which had long plotted to silence black leaders deemed threats to national security? Even decades later, newly unearthed files and testimonies hint at government complicity, but the full truth remains buried in shadows. The assassination of Malcolm was not just the killing of a man. It was an attempt to extinguish a movement, to silence a voice that had grown too powerful, too fearless, and too global for America to contain. Yet in killing him, his enemies only amplified him. His final words, his last speeches, his vision, they became immortal, echoing louder than ever before. The Audubon Ballroom became a crime scene that day, but history remembers it as something else, the place where a man was struck down and a legend was born. Malcolm X's body was buried in the earth of Ferncliff Cemetery, but his voice refused to rest there. Death silenced his heartbeat, but not his message. In many ways, the bullets that tore through him only carried his words further, igniting a flame no assassin could extinguish. Just months after his death, the autobiography of Malcolm X, co-written with Alex Haley, was published. It became an instant classic, a blueprint for rebellion, a scripture of self-discovery and defiance. In its pages, readers found not just the story of a man, but a mirror reflecting their own struggles against oppression, hypocrisy, and identity. For many young black Americans, it was a call to rise. For others across the globe, it became a universal story of liberation. Malcolm's speeches, captured on grainy recordings and brittle pages, continued to echo long after he was gone. His words about racism, injustice, and power carried a haunting familiarity, as if he were not speaking in the 1960s, but whispering directly into the crisis of today. When he said, "You can't separate peace from freedom, because no one can be at peace unless he has his freedom," the truth lingered, timeless and sharp. Across the world, revolutionaries took note. In Africa, the Caribbean, and the Middle East, Malcolm's vision of global solidarity inspired movements for independence and justice. In America, his voice was resurrected in the Black Power movement, carried by men and women who refused to bow. Even decades later, his image appears on protest signs, his words quoted in rap lyrics, his name invoked in classrooms and marshes. And yet, Malcolm remains an enigma. Was he a prophet of division or a prophet of unity? A man of anger or a man of transformation? His life was filled with contradictions. The hustler who became a holy man, the separatist who became a global humanist, the fiery militant who learned to preach brotherhood. These contradictions are what keep his story alive, forcing each generation to wrestle with his meaning anew. The mystery of his death only deepens his legacy. With every declassified FBI file, every testimony that emerges, the suspicion grows that Malcolm's assassination was bigger than a feud within the Nation of Islam. Did the U.S. government, terrified of his growing global influence, play a hidden role? Was Malcolm X silenced because he had begun to connect the struggles of Black America to revolutions across the world? The questions remain unanswered, and perhaps that is why his voice endures. For though his enemies tried to bury him, they only planted a seed. Today, his voice still thunders in the chants of protesters, still challenges the complacent, still disturbs the comfortable. Malcolm X lives wherever injustice exists, reminding us that truth, once spoken, cannot be killed. He was a man, yes, flawed, human, mortal. But he became something larger, a voice that history could not silence, a voice that would not, and will not, die. Malcolm X's story is not just history, it is a mirror. His voice still echoes in protests, in classrooms, in whispered conversations about justice and freedom. America tried to silence him, but his words remain louder than ever, challenging us to ask what has truly changed and what struggles still remain. Was Malcolm a prophet of his time or of ours? If his journey moved you, subscribe to Tales Beyond Time for more untold histories that refuse to fade. Share your thoughts below. Is Malcolm's voice still alive today? Join the discussion, because history is never silent.